So good evening and welcome. I'm really delighted to be introducing this conversation between presidents. This is a collaboration between the Sussex Wildlife Trust and the Sussex Archaeological Society. And I'm Tor Lawrence, I'm the Chief Executive of Sussex Wildlife Trust. So the partnership between the two organisations was strengthened at the conference earlier this year, put on by the Sussex Archaeological Society on climate change. So many thanks to Matt Pope for starting off this partnership really between the two organisations. We are membership organisations. When we rely on our members, between us we have 40,000 members, and we had 435, I think, at least registrations for this evening. So quite a popular talk for us. So welcome to all of you. So between us, the two organisations are stewarding wildlife and heritage across Sussex. And it's our birthday year. The Sussex Archaeological Society was 175. I think that's right this year. And the Sussex Wildlife Trust was 60 this year. So happy birthday to all of us. So this evening we have two of our best minds in conversation on a very topical subject. We've got Dr. Tony Whitbread, who was 27 years employed by the Sussex Wildlife Trust. He had 1 year off and he came back as the president. So thank you, Tony, for that really long service. And we've got Professor Martin Bell, who is a professor at the University of Reading and the Sussex Archaeological Society president. Really pleased to have you both here. So the way this will work is Tony will give a 10-minute presentation from his perspective, and then Martin will give a 10-minute presentation, and then they will have a conversation between them. Please post your questions. We will, if we get a lot of questions, produce a Q&A sheet afterwards. And if we can get a word in between them, then we will ask some of the questions that the audience poses, and our Director of Conservation Policy, Henry Brocklebank, will facilitate those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to President number one, Tony Whitbread.
Thanks very much indeed, Tor. Thank you. And if you give me a second, I shall share my screen and we'll have a little conversation about rewilding. Rewilding, is it a brave new idea or is it a recreation of the past? I mean, what do we mean by rewilding? So I think that's the place I want to start really, is in order to address this, see where we are. I'd like to just canter through in just 10 minutes what I think we mean by rewilding. So first of all, what do we mean by rewilding? Well, essentially, it's about restoring natural processes, restoring our wildlife, restoring our ecosystems by restoring the natural processes that drive nature. Now, very, very quickly, basically, that's two natural processes that are opposing each other. There are more, but let's boil this down to just two natural processes that oppose each other and actually are the driving forces in rewilding. In one direction, you've got vegetation succession, the growth of trees and the formation of forest. And in the other direction, you've got natural disturbance. Now, I'm very proud of this PowerPoint presentation here. That means that it's in dynamic balance. So there's this dynamic balance going on between the two. So just to explain what I mean by that a little bit more before we go on, you probably all know about succession. If you leave an area alone, if you stop farming it, you stop grazing it, you stop disturbing it, then you get this blossoming of plants. You get all these trees and shrubs which form. That picture there is just 15 years. Nobody planted anything there apart from the jays. They planted some things. That was all natural regeneration. That's the process of succession. So you start off maybe with an open grassland like this, then gradually the acorns come in, the thorns start to grow, and then eventually you get a thicket or a scrub area, and then eventually that turns into high forest. Now, in the old days, until about 1960s, we used to think, well, that's it, that's the end. That's succession, natural succession, and that's what Britain will be covered in. You've probably all heard the kind of myths that a squirrel could have hopped from Land's End to John O'Groats without ever treading on the ground. That is complete nonsense. There may have been some forest like this, there may have been quite a lot, but it certainly isn't true that the whole area was completely covered in dense forest. Most of our species don't live in that habitat. So we know something else was going on as well. And that something else was the opposing force of natural disturbance. something coming along to actually oppose the growth of trees and knock it back again. So we can think of examples, the erosion and accretion that you get with flooding rivers. There's a small example there, but I'm sure you've all seen very big examples of how natural disturbance levels forests through flooding and so on. Some of us can remember the 1987 storm, a classic example of natural disturbance, massively opening up these forests and resetting the clock on vegetation succession. Now, these are not events which damage nature. They're not even separate to nature. They are nature. These are the things which actually create openings in forest. They are part of rewilding. And of course, there's more than that. Years ago, many years ago, the northern temperate zone had beasts like this in it. Big animals which didn't merely live in the forest, they drove the forest. They had a major impact on the forest, and habitats that were there were a large result because of these animals. A couple of disadvantages of these animals is that they're big and savage, and actually a lot of them are now extinct. So we can't actually just kind of reintroduce these and think we're starting to rewild again. So the idea of big grazing animals being part of an ecosystem is fundamental to actually the formation of rewilding. But what you can do, of course, is you can actually use proxies for wild animals. And that's actually what people are doing these days. A lot of the rewilding projects with the conversation is about grazing and browsing animals, not because they're a nice to have, but because they are a major driving force in rewilding. So vegetation succession in one direction, natural disturbance in the other, dynamic balance between the two, and that gives you vegetation patchiness, which makes all the biodiversity that we see. Okay, so what do you want to do? What do you need to do when you rewild? What do you need to do in order to do rewilding? Well, it's fairly simple. You get succession going again. So you encourage those trees to naturally regenerate. Maybe in some areas you may have to replant. I prefer natural regeneration, but there we go. Get succession going again. Against the succession, you get the disturbance processes going again. It's a job to predict when there might be a windstorm, but you can actually get those big grazing animals interacting with the landscape. Next thing you can do is restore the things that impact on the big grazing animals. You can see where I'm going with some of this. Predators. Predators actually have an impact on those animals and determine where they graze and where they don't graze, and therefore determine what vegetation looks like. And of course, what you also need to do is most of our landforms have been heavily modified, particularly our river valleys. We may be talking about that a bit later on, I think. Particularly our river valleys have been heavily modified. Our rivers are canalised, straightened, deepened, and set in their courses. They're out of touch with their floodplain. So we have a very unnatural circumstance. Now you can see from that list, we're probably not going to be able to reintroduce or restart all of these natural processes. So actually that brings me to another point, and that is, well, what do you do if you can't bring back all those natural processes? Well, what you can do is copy them. And this is part of my thought process, I suppose, is that we tend to think of nature conservation management and rewilding as two opposites, with the two sides fighting each other. I don't see that at all. We can copy natural processes, we can mimic them, and that actually is conservation management. That's the way you do conservation management. So, for example, some of these things that we do in woodlands to manage them for nature conservation, yeah, they look pretty heavy and pretty much like management, but to a large extent, they can be mimicking some of the effects of natural processes. Yes, I know the wild aurochs don't cut pieces of wood into neat lengths and then stack them all together, but you get the idea. Management creates openness in forests, and so do the natural processes. So you can actually mimic those things, and it starts to become conservation management. Okay, I want to labour this point a little bit. If you then apply that way of thinking to what we do in gardens and what we do in conservation management, you could say, this isn't a trowel. It looks like a trowel, but no, it's not a trowel. That's actually a very small wild boar. It's doing the same thing on a very small scale as a wild boar. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this one. Garden shears? No, they're not garden shears. They're a particularly focused wild aurochs. You know the wild aurochs, a huge extinct wild cow. Well, your garden shears are doing a similar job to the browsing of a wild aurochs. Okay, one point I'd like to make here, though, is that actually in rewilding, often we look for the answer. But there's a huge problem with even thinking like that, because where you end up with is with divergent questions. Now, these are questions that don't have a simple answer. Everyone can come up with a different answer, and that's fine. So they start a conversation. You have to think about where the balance is, where, what decision we make, bearing in mind that these are divergent questions. Here's some examples. We talk about the wild. So what is wild? Now, that's a very open question, and you can have a conference on what that is and still not come to a solid conclusion. What is, even if you know what it is, what's the relevance of wild to today? If you're restoring something, where are you restoring back to? Which bit of the past are you wanting to recreate, and why? It's part of the issue here. Why are we trying to think about recreating the past? Or are we developing something about a future nature, putting things together to make a future nature? And again, what do we mean by that? If we want to restore natural processes as part of a future nature, well, what are those natural processes? I've given you a quick overview, but you get into the detail and there's a lot of devil in the detail. How do you know if they're working appropriately? How do you even know what appropriately means? And what does success look like? How do you know whether you're actually succeeding in your job of rewilding an area? What does it look like? We can't have objectives because that would be against the principle of allowing nature to run its course. So it gets a bit more difficult. And I just thought about the word rewilding. A lot of people have railed against the word for various reasons, and I can understand that. Rewilding. Well, first of all, there's the re bit, rewilding. Are we just restoring back to something? Are we recreating the past? We don't seem to have that problem with other re-words like restoring the economy. We're quite happy with that. But when we say rewilding, we're thinking we're always talking about the past. So that's one issue. The next one is about rewilding. Wild. What do we mean by the wild? Are we actually trying to rewild something, create the wild? What does that mean? What does the wild mean? So there's not much left in that word, is there? Well, there's the ing at the end. That actually relates to the processes that we're trying to restore. What are those processes? How do you know if they're working? So every element of the word rewilding is controversial and opens up discussion. And actually, I think that's very good because that gives us a bit of challenge. Okay, well, what we're really saying is that rewilding is good and traditional nature conservation is bad. That's true, isn't it? Oh, no, that's wrong. It's actually traditional nature conservation that's good and rewilding that's bad. I think you probably get from the tone of my voice, I think that's a stupid way to look at things. These are all parts of the same approach to nature conservation. And I'm going to illustrate that with the following diagram. This is just a quick, I suppose, Mickey Mouse diagram. Increasing naturalness as you go up, increasing management as you go down. As the site gets bigger, then you have increasing ability to encourage naturalness. As the site is smaller, then there's an increasing requirement to do management in order to create the diversity of nature that's there. So you can see, and also you get different approaches to management at different scales. It's not all one thing or all another. It would be ridiculous to kind of try and coppice the Serengeti or to mow the Yellowstone National Park. Equally, it's impossible to actually try and encourage natural processes on something the size of your back garden. It doesn't work. You can pick up the principle, but it doesn't work to just try and rewild entirely. So, rewilding, is it a brave new idea? Actually, no, I don't think it is. I think it's been around for a very long time. We talk about landscape scale, we talk about restoring ecosystems, we talk about bringing nature back. The words have been different, but actually it's been fairly central to nature conservation for a very long time. We're always talking about understanding the way nature works and encouraging it. Is it actually about recreating the past, just finding a period in the past and recreating? Well, no, it's not. It can't be that either. But I want to summarize with a few points now before handing over to Martin, and that is, well, we talk about recreating the past. Well, no, it's not about recreating the past, but fundamentally, it's about learning from the past. We often make the wrong assumptions about what we think we know of the past, and actually, therefore, extrapolate from that. Well, if what we think we know about the past is wrong, that upsets us right from the start. So no, I don't think it is about recreating the past, but you can learn from the past, and that's vital. The other thing is it the restoration? Well, it is the restoration of nature through the processes, by restoring the processes that drive nature. So that's the central core of rewilding. But actually, the word rewilding is now being used in so many different contexts. I used to be very precious about this. I used to think, no, that's wrong. We've got to stick to the right definition. But it's inspired, the word has inspired so many people and has driven so much action. I'm much less worried about it now. And to be honest, I think we shouldn't be too precious. Making things a bit more wild, moving a little bit along the wild spectrum, a little bit more nature, a little bit more wildness in there, even if it's a very small step, and calling it rewilding, I don't worry about that. If you mow your lawn a little bit less, well, technically, I don't think it's rewilding. But if you call it rewilding, well, good on you, that's fine. And lastly, well, very often we can't restore natural processes. We can't restore all of them, certainly. You can copy them, you can do something about it, and actually that moves you straight into traditional nature conservation. These are not two different things. These are part of the same spectrum of activity that we do. So on that note, I think I shall leave it at that as a kind of overview of my thoughts about what rewilding is, and stop sharing my screen and hand over to Martin to give us a bit of an archaeologist's perspective on rewilding. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Tony. Can people see my screen okay?
We certainly can, yes.
Super. Well, Tony has argued that we can learn from the past, and my brief today is to say something about how we might be able to achieve that objective. Sorry. First of all, I'd like to say something about the context of this. The Lawson report of 2010, Making Space for Nature, makes a strong case for bigger, better, and more joined up nature reserves. And that's something that's developed in the 2018 25-year Environment Plan. The UK Environment Bill promised a green Brexit, the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. The UK Agriculture Bill promises provision for direct payments to farmers following Brexit, along the principle of public money for delivery of public goods. And the government proposes that by 2030, 30% of land will be devoted to nature conservation. That's plus some 4,000 square kilometres. But the problem is that Natural England's own figures show that 50% of nature reserves are not being managed in a sustainable way. The drive, following the Lawson report, is for much larger nature reserves, and biodiversity enhancement is creating a powerful lobby for rewilding. Now, rewilding literally is letting nature take its course, whatever that may be. But as Tony has pointed out, that is something which one really needs to interrogate the subtleties of that issue. A rather radical view is put by George Monbiot's book, Feral. And Monbiot, writing in The Guardian, said that good public policy depends on constant challenge and debate. And I do think that very strongly that that's the case. And these are debates to which we as archaeologists and nature conservationists should be actively contributing. A very influential theory in the development of nature conservation strategy is the work of Frans Vera, the Dutch ecologist who developed the woodland mosaic theory. And Vera argued that the early Holocene wildwood was more open and park-like, not the totally closed woodland previously envisaged, and Tony's already introduced us to that issue. His theories have been very important in foregrounding the role of disturbance factors, but I think sometimes perhaps a bit misleading in focusing only on animals and seeming to assume that disturbance was something that was evenly distributed across the landscape. Some paleoecological evidence challenges the universality of the theory, suggesting more closed woodland in some places. Now, this theory has been very important in the development of the Knapp estate in Sussex, where fences have been removed, drains blocked, rivers restored to natural state, natural grazing by free-ranging deer, cattle and Tamworth pigs. And that has had remarkable success in increasing biodiversity as explained in Isabella Tree's outstanding book shown at the top right of the screen. But how do we apply these concepts to the management of particular landscapes? This is Wilmington in Sussex, a site of special scientific interest, rare chalk grassland with several nationally rare species. Such designated sites are generally managed to protect rare species and habitats. Here we've got an added complication, the management of the heritage asset as well, the Long Man giant hill figure, which I think was made in the 16th or 17th century AD. Others prefer a much earlier date. But how natural is this grassland which we manage by grazing?
Martin, could you go into the full slideshow of because it makes it bigger for the participants? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I wondered what had happened.
Thank you.
To what extent were the South Downs once forested? Well, below the Long Man of Wilmington and at the other sites shown here, there are substantial tree throw pits containing woodland molluscs. And these are below sequences of sediment indicative of pastoral soils. Most chalkland Neolithic sites in Sussex were in woodland scrub environments, and the pollen evidence also points to woodland. But how legitimate is it to rewood some of these downland areas? Well, at Hollingbury Hillfort in Sussex, the council has proposed rewilding the golf course. But in proposing that, we need to consider what effect the woodland cover would have on the heritage aspects of this landscape, not just the Hillfort, but the other surrounding monuments. Reintroductions are a key part of rewilding and something to which the archaeological dimension gives a valuable perspective. The EU Habitats Directive of 1992 urges reintroduction to enhance biodiversity. And actually, in the past, that's been quite controversial and rather tightly regulated in the UK. But it's now increasingly flagged as an important way to enhance biodiversity in the 25-year environment strategy. Its advocates can point to major successes shown at the top of the screen there. Red kites, white-tailed sea eagles, ospreys, all of which were widely present in the British Isles before post-medieval persecution. Cranes recently reintroduced to the Severn Estuary, where they were very common 7,500 years ago, as the footprints shown at the top right show. And the quintessential case, I think, is that of the beaver, extinct in Britain since the 16th or 18th century AD. Bryony Coles has documented extensive archaeological evidence for their widespread occurrence, and that helps to make the case for reintroduction. There is evidence for beaver on 4 archaeological sites in Sussex between the Neolithic and early medieval. This was a keystone species in niche construction, habitat creation, and flood alleviation. And I'm pleased to say that that is something which I think there is now a very broad consensus about. Currently, beavers are being reintroduced in a controlled way to 2 sites in West Sussex. Now, here's a more tricky case, and this is the aurochs. The aurochs has been extinct in Britain since about 1300 Cal BC and globally extinct since 1628. So what would the effects of the aurochs have been in maintaining openings within the wildwood? And can we substitute for the extinct aurochs with other cattle, perhaps the het cattle or bison? Bison recently introduced to Blean in Kent with some controversy. However, actually there's no certain evidence for the bison in post-glacial Britain at all. And there are other cases. Recent rewilding texts emphasize the influence of other grazers, the role of the horse and the elk in creating a mosaic of openings and woodland. But actually both the horse and the elk were largely extinct by 10,000 years ago, before the climax woodland had a chance to develop. So my point here really is that rewilding needs a robust evidence base and is deserving of targeted research in its own right. Then we come to the landscape scale. Here's an example of the Cuckmere estuary. Deeply incised during the last glaciation, it became an open flooded estuary 8,000 years ago, and there's 23 meters of sediment in the drowned river valley of the Cuckmere. The floods at the top there give some idea of what it would once have been like. And it was flooded, an open estuary, in the Doomsday period, because we've got evidence of salt works in AD 1086. Indeed, LiDAR images shown at the top right show curvilinear channels of former salt marsh and evidence of partial drainage, much of which is 19th century. So there's a big current debate whether to allow the river to develop in a more natural way, abandoning coastal protection so that salt marsh and flooded areas benefit wildlife. Or on the other hand, do we protect the familiar cultural heritage of the 19th and 20th centuries? The problem is that there's a much earlier cultural heritage and environmental history as well, which we need to build into our thinking about what the natural state of this river was. Now, I've identified here what I see as some of the key questions, but what we really want to hear, of course, is some of the questions from the audience. But I'll just leave that there for a second to perhaps stimulate people's thoughts, whilst highlighting the last point there that I particularly want to make. Is there scope for novel partnerships of wildlife trusts, archaeologists and historians to build a consensus which helps to answer some of the questions which Tony and I have raised in our presentation? So that concludes the points that I wanted to make. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we'll go back to conversation between Tony and I.
We'll have a bit of a chat. Yeah, very interesting stuff. Thanks very much. There's always so much more you can learn by you listen to an expert. I mean, one question I was thinking of discussing with you is that I've seen several papers which indicate that how open the habitats were was much more in the previous interglacial than in the current interglacial. You know, before the last ice age or the last spread of the glaciers, there were many more, much bigger animals around, and the landscape was much more open. And in fact, Oliver Rackham, who's one of our greatest woodland ecologists, sadly now passed away, he actually he suggested that the density of woodland in this interglacial was unnaturally high because humans had already wiped out many of the big animals that should be here in this interglacial. It's a pet belief of mine that we ought to have an elephant in Sussex, but we don't.
Yes, well, there are many intriguing issues there. I don't think there's any doubt, actually, that earlier interglacials, most notably perhaps the Ipswichian and the Hoxnean, were generally more open than our present interglacial. And of course, as you rightly say, that is because of the effect of the megafauna. What is more challenging, I think, is the question of whether the extinction of the megafauna is really down to human agency. That's increasingly argued, actually, in the rewilding literature, but we've got to grapple with the problem that the extinction around 12 to 14,000 years ago of many taxa also coincides with the most rapid and dramatic periods of climate change that we can actually closely document. Now, you could argue that there were other really rapid climate changes in other interglacials, but the reality is that those haven't been studied in the same depth as the late glacial Holocene transition, when we know just how rapid the climate changes were. So those certainly offer another possible explanation for the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. But academic opinion remains divided on this issue, as it has been for the last 50 years.
I remember that at college, you know, we were talking about it then and coming to roughly the same conclusions. And it seems there was a kind of interaction between human agency and climate change, perhaps. But I seem to also remember that there are places around the world where the climate change wasn't really very strong, and yet the extinctions were also correlated with the appearance of humans. But maybe that's another subject, I don't know.
Well, yes, it's true, but the trouble is, in some of those areas, like Australia, for instance, the evidence for the precise dating of the extinctions is by no means as clear as it is in, let's say, North America or Northwest Europe, where we've got a lot of very well preserved, well dated sites. And for things like the Irish elk, we know very precisely the date of extinction. And of course, that occurred in Ireland at a time before we think there were any humans there at all. So it's a complicated issue.
Complicated issue. I just had another thought actually about, I remember reading a paper a while ago, which is about how open the woodlands were. It was actually by another woodland ecologist called Keith Kirby, and he asked the question, was the wild state of Britain basically forests with holes in it, or was it mostly open with groves of woodland? And the third question was, and does it matter? But he came to the conclusion that actually, no, it doesn't matter. And this is why I was getting a little bit concerned about, I think it was Franz Vera, actually. My first feeling about him and what he was saying was that he was building a false opposite, and that actually ecologists had always said that the natural state of the landscape in Britain was actually incredibly diverse. It wasn't ever just the idea that this was nothing but wall-to-wall trees. Even if it was dense forest, there were big holes in it which varied. So I'm still worried that we've been setting up a false opposite. And I'm actually, to come down against George Monbiot, I think what he did was fantastic, and it's down to him that we've actually now talking about rewilding. But actually, I think his book was fundamentally flawed because he didn't mention, well, he thought any form of disturbance was a bad thing. And actually the progress towards dense forests was what we should all be aiming for. So I think he actually set us back to pre-1960 thought sometimes.
Yes, I think it certainly hasn't helped in trying to develop an understanding with agricultural communities in particular, because it's I think very overstated in terms of its criticism of things like Welsh upland farmers who, frankly got their backs to the wall under any circumstances and really don't deserve to be pilloried. But of course, his great skill is in exciting debate, isn't it? And that's part of my point, really, that it does disturb me that we've got such important issues currently in this area, which I don't see the politicians debating at all. Indeed, I'm not clear whether there's any difference between the major political parties on this particular issue. Now, actually, I think the 25-year environment strategy is a pretty impressive document. The question is, really, is the commitment there to genuinely deliver it? Or is this a way of trying to win over young people?
Well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I've seen, we're both a bit long in the tooth, and I'm sure we've all seen fantastic strategies written by government, all seem fantastic. Years later, it seems that they were just words, and whether it's just the same again. When you get our Prime Minister joking about Build Back Beaver, you start to worry that is he actually taking this with the seriousness it needs to be taken? And actually, thinking about the extent of the recovery that we need when it comes to wildlife, it's absolutely massive. We are the worst of the G7 countries when it comes to wildlife. We're, I think, 189th out of 214th when it comes to biodiversity. We're one of the most biodiversity deprived countries in the world. And yet we still, whenever we have the conversations with the powers that be, it's about compromising yet more away. So I do worry about whether, good words, but let's see some actions.
Yes, of course, this is the same Prime Minister that said that it's the newts that are massively holding back this country. Now, I don't feel I'm in a country that's being massively held back by newts, to be honest. No. I had a really distressing example of this just in the last week, actually, when I learned that one of the oldest national nature reserves in England, the Overton and Fifield Downs National Nature Reserve in Wiltshire, designated in 1955, is now no longer a national nature reserve because the landowner requested it to be deregistered. And it's a bit of a disaster from my point of view, because I've got a long-term experiment on that site, which is designed for completion in 2088, long after I'm dead, actually. But such things, you know, cause one to question whether the rhetoric about enhanced nature conservation in the UK is matched by the reality. And I think that links back to the point that we were making, because by engendering a more active debate about these issues, then that helps to keep it on the boil and helps to ensure that the politicians are actually delivering what they've promised to deliver.
Yes, and of course, one thing I worry about as well is that actually if we're too active in terms of saying, okay, we can rebuild something, then politicians look at the other end of the spectrum and think, well, therefore we can destroy what's over there. And we get some very dodgy discussions about net biodiversity gain or loss. Now, some of these concepts are quite good, but I actually really worry when it gets into the actions of some politicians. And so, yes, rewilding I actually do think is a fantastic thing. It's one of the few examples where you can actually show things building and growing and getting better, whereas much of nature conservation outside nature reserves is about simply trying to hold the line. So I think that's great. But if it's turned and used in a way of saying, well, we can run up a new habitat whenever we want, so it doesn't matter if we destroy one, you know, that's abusing the whole situation.
Yes, it's a real challenge, and getting it on the scale that's required. And I mean, that's where I find it very difficult to conceptualize what is required from the nature conservation side alongside the massive scale of housing development that is currently proposed, all too often in very inappropriate locations, particularly in southeast England, but I'm sure much more widely, actually. There is an inherent contradiction there, really, isn't there, which needs exploring. And I think we do need to articulate better what scale of rewilding or enhanced nature conservation, what spatial scale is actually required in certain contexts.
I agree, and I think there's something here about policy priority, because for all the time I was working in my 27 years in the Wildlife Trust, yes, we had, you know, sometimes very good sounding conservation policies in all sorts of documents and plans, but actually when it comes down to it, they were at the bottom of the pile when it comes to hierarchy or choice. It was the bit that was left after you've had your airports or your roads or your particularly your housing. So yes, the wildlife could have the corners that were remaining. Now, I think we're at a stage now where that has to be reversed. The requirement, because of the biodiversity crisis, the requirement has to be the other way around. We need to have a functioning ecological network with rewilding in it, but also with more traditional forms of nature conservation and all sorts of agriculture as well. And actually the development has to fit in the gaps that aren't required for ecological enhancement.
Yes, and I mean, that certainly isn't happening at the moment, is it? I mean, the development is happening where there's the maximum profitability or the landowner willingness, I would say. There's no real sense of rural land use planning detectable in much of what's happening.
I think Henry's coming in because we got off the subject of rewilding now, haven't we?
Well, no, it's all fascinating, but we have got some really, really good questions. So I want to give you guys the opportunity to answer them. And I'm going to start off with one that actually straddles both of your areas of expertise. There's archaeology and biodiversity wrapped into one by a question from Hannah Fluck. What is the relationship between our current biodiversity and the Holocene human activity? To what extent does the biodiversity we value today reflect that history of human activity that shaped our landscape? That's another webinar.
It is, isn't it?
So really interested to hear your views. Tony, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just saying one word answer. The answer must be massively, isn't it? I mean, essentially, we live in a cultural landscape, and actually it's the result of, I would say it's not natural, but it's not artificial. This is why we call all our habitats semi-natural, but it actually is the product of human management of a natural system. And actually, yeah, all of our habitats, I think virtually without exception, are not natural, they're semi-natural. So what's there now is entirely the product of thousands of years of human activity, but it's not totally artificial. We can never say it's totally man-made or human-made. It's still influenced by nature as well.
So Martin, could you elaborate for us non-archaeologists and non-geologists when the actual Holocene period was, and yeah, over to you to answer that question of the impact of the Holocene.
Well, the Holocene is the last 11,500 years since the end of the last ice age. Great question there from Hannah, who's actually somebody who's made a very significant contribution herself to these big debates. And I would really answer this, I think, by arguing that understanding the contribution of human agency to biodiversity and questions of extinction and introduction years ago were perhaps a rather esoteric area of academic debate, but now are absolutely central to these issues of wildlife conservation and sustainability. In other words, it's recently been discovered actually that quite a number of species that we thought were native to the British Isles are actually introduced. And then there are other species which we didn't realize occurred here, but clearly did in the past in the paleo-environmental record. So what this highlights, I think, is the relevance of the field that I work in, environmental archaeology, to understanding the composition and the character of the British landscape today, its plants and animals.
Okay, thank you. This Rich, we don't have a surname, said, this is a very similar sort of vein of question. When did humans stop being natural agents of disturbance?
Well, that's another seminar, isn't it? I'm not sure how to answer that.
I think what one can say is that for most of the period before the end of the last ice age, their impact was, I would say, mostly relatively small scale, subject to the caveat that we talked about as regards the Pleistocene megafauna. But it's really the use of fire, I think, that particularly alters landscapes on rather a large scale. And the answer to this may be quite surprising to some people, because there is evidence for the impact of fire in the British Isles right at the beginning of the post-glacial, within about 500 years of the start of the post-glacial period. In fact, before woodland was densely covering the British Isles. So I would say that's the main period when we can get a really clear signs of impact. But it's going to be relatively local, of course, to specific areas, although it might have increased the extent of moorland and heathland communities. There are a lot of Mesolithic sites of that period on the greensand heaths in Sussex, for instance, and some of those seem to have developed during the Mesolithic period.
I'd like to go to a slightly more philosophical end of the spectrum. It could be argued that we are part of nature, and actually whatever we do is natural. And actually, therefore, what we do is natural, but also the choice to do something different is also natural. So it becomes a self-defeating argument. Doing all this destruction from humans is natural, yes, but also conservationists, they must be natural as well. So it gets into a bit of a strange argument. You could say that we stopped being natural as soon as we developed a word for the environment or for nature, because that meant we were seeing it as something separate to ourselves. I reckon if you went back, I don't know, 100,000 years and spoke to a human then, they wouldn't have had a word for nature as somewhere other than where they were.
Yes, I think Tony's first part of Tony's answer is the right one, really, that, people are part of nature. And one of the revelations of recent years, really, is the agency of other creatures in bringing about environmental change. The beavers, the grazing animals, and so on. These are important disturbance factors. Floods and storms as well, as Tony mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just scrolling through the questions because there's a couple. There's one about pollen that's really good, but I'm going to go to a point by Matt Pope, which kind of leads on from the previous question, which I think Tony will have something to say on this one. Humans had a role in the creation of important, cherished and ecologically important landscapes like chalk grassland, moorland, peatland, bog. How can we, nuance the concept of rewilding to take account of these anthropogenic landscapes?
Well, when I teach rewilding courses, I'm very clear there are places where you could think about doing rewilding, and there are places where you definitely wouldn't. And actually, some of these much cherished human artifact habitats, that's one place you would not do rewilding. You may be able to nuance it slightly, but actually, you think about the downs and the chalk grassland there, well, they're a result of sheep grazing mostly. And also that really important sheep grazed habitat, the downland grassland, only covers 4% of the downs. So if you can't put rewilding on the other 96%, you're not really trying very hard. So actually, I think there are places where actually we don't know how nature would derive the same mixture of species, but we do know how human agency has created those habitats. And that's where you should be doing careful traditional nature conservation. Rewilding should be placed for places that are of lower risk. Now, you may actually vary that, and I completely pick up Martin's approach that we need to be challenged, because sometimes I think we use that as an excuse to just go back to the way we've always done nature conservation. We need to challenge ourselves, see if there's another way of doing it, but actually I'll be very cautious on some of these particularly high quality nature conservation sites.
Thank you, Tony. Martin.
The chalk grassland, of course, is an interesting one, because the close cropped chalk grassland of the sort of early part of the 20th century was, as Tony says, the product of a very intensive, actually overgrazing by sheep, but also, of course, the effects of the rabbit, which was an introduced species from Roman or Norman times. So this balance between extinctions and introductions is a fascinating issue, really, that I think only now are we beginning to understand the role of introductions rather more fully and build that into these debates.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a question from Stephen Woodcock. So changing tack entirely now. So we're talking about pollen data. So on the pollen data regarding trees on the South Downs, how accurate is it in locating trees? Clearly, there is a lot of trees in the Weald, which is very nearby. So Martin, I expect you know an awful lot about the accuracy of pollen data. What's your views?
Well, that's a really good point, actually, because the pollen data comes from the Vale of Brooks and Amberley Wild Brooks, principally, which are just off the downs. And it's actually quite difficult to disentangle the pollen record that relates to the downs and that from the Weald. But on balance, I think what it indicates is that there were quite a lot of trees on the chalk. There's one particular site right by Mount Caburn, which is within tens of meters of the chalk, which does suggest a fairly closed woodland environment. And of course, that is next to an area of short grazed grassland, which is of great botanical significance. So that environment does seem to have changed since prehistory. But the basic question is a very good one, because we need more evidence for the paleoecology of the chalk. And even in the Neolithic period, you know, I said these sites were largely wooded. That's broadly true, but we haven't got enough of them, and we haven't got enough sites where the evidence is really well preserved. And I'm delighted to say that on Sunday this week, I visited a new site right up on the South Downs in West Sussex, which we got samples from, and which I'm hoping may provide some answers to this question. These are mollusk samples rather than pollen, but you know, ongoing research can be done.
That's really good, and I think what's really good is building up evidence from different sort of genera. Because I remember in the past, when pollen data was being used quite a long time ago, when Oliver Rackham wrote his books, he made it very clear, and I think the palynologists made it very clear, that at the time it gave you a good idea of species composition, but not a very good idea of structure. You could actually have the same species composition with all sorts of different combinations of trees, of openness and closeness. So it's very difficult to judge, and that probably remains. And also, I think the way we analyse, the way we look at some of this pollen data, and I'm not an expert, so I'm a bit cautious saying this, but some of the species we look at in a different way. I mean, as an ecologist, I know that, for example, hazel doesn't grow very well under dense canopy, and it doesn't flower, so it doesn't produce much pollen. But we know there was an awful lot of hazel pollen around, so it couldn't really have come from the dense woodland. Similarly with oak, which actually gradually disappears in dense woodland. It regenerates in the open. So, and there's a lot of oak associated beetles which are throughout the fossil period, and yet oak would disappear in dense woodland. So some of these things in the past we thought of hazel, oak, that means woodland. Nowadays I think we're more cautious about it. It might mean woodland, but it's more likely to mean some sort of amazing complexity that we can't even really picture.
Yes, I mean, Tony's quite right there that what we need is what I call a multi-proxy approach, where we're drawing on the maximum range of different paleo-environmental sources. Okay, the pollen's very important, but if we've got seeds, if we've got wood remains, if we've got insects, we've got mollusks, you know, when we've got all that evidence, we can develop a very much richer picture. And one of the sad things in Sussex, I think, is that there has been very little wetland archaeology. Now we've got some great wetlands in the river valleys, in the Amberley wild brooks, in the Pevensey levels and the Romney Marsh, but we haven't really focused as much as we might have done, with the exception of fairly recent work on Romney Marsh, on getting out the paleo-environmental story from those landscapes where all these richer sources of environmental evidence can be brought to bear on research questions.
Maybe a partnership project with the Wildlife Trust using some of our nature reserves as a source. I don't know.
Yes, yes. I mean, certainly, as far as I know, the detail of paleo-environmental work on the Amberley wild brooks, for instance, I mean, the last work I know of was done in about 1980. I mean, maybe there's some other work, and in fact, it's a very coarse analysis with, if I'm right in remembering, only one radiocarbon date. Nowadays, if we were looking to do something like that, we'd be looking for a sequence of probably 30 radiocarbon dates to get a really precise chronology, which we could model and really work out the history of the landscape.
You'll have to come back to our peatlands in the middle of the Amberley wild brooks.
So you've both mentioned herbivores, and Martin, you mentioned about horses and elk going extinct, which I could ask endless questions about why that happened, etc. However, George Orty has asked, as his question is deer ! Whatever we mean by rewilding, it is, in many parts of Sussex, impossible with the current density of deer populations approaching equivalent to domesticated farm animal stocking densities. How do we get the public on board with deer population control? In the absence of a widespread cull or deer fence, is there any way of deterring deer from a small 10-acre woodland grass and orchard area? So there's a kind of technical, but a conceptual question as well. Tony, do you want to start?
Gosh, how do you answer that? I mean, he's right. You know, there are more deer in the landscape now than in any time in history, as far as I know, and they're getting more all the time. We've got a variety of species. It's not just our little roe deer, but where I live, we get masses of fallow deer as well. And whereas I think grazing and browsing is an important driver in woodland ecology, it can get very unbalanced, and it's probably one of these features which is driving more woodland loss or more loss of woodland species than almost anything else. We've got more woodland in the southeast than for a very long time, but we're still losing woodland species, partly probably because of deer. So yes, how do we get people on board with the idea that deer need to be controlled, or we need to introduce predators, and that seems to be a long way off. I don't know what the answer is. I know that actually whenever there's an attempt to increase the market for venison, which would help drive it, it never seems to work. Why aren't we eating venison? I mean, yes, I don't want to offend all the vegetarians here, but assuming you're a meat eater already, then actually it makes more sense to eat something that's had a natural upbringing outside and that's wild and had a good life than it does to eat something that's been brought up indoors. So why aren't we eating more venison? I'll get some complaints about that, I'm sure, but there we go.
Martin, have you got anything to add from a herbivore and an archaeological perspective?
I eat quite a bit of venison. Of course, it's much more healthy in terms of its fat content as well, because it's not been managed to be so fatty. But I would like to come back to Henry's point actually about why the horse and the elk became extinct, because of course the classic explanation, which is still there in the literature, is that they became extinct because this woodland closed in and there was no longer a suitable habitat for them. But I mean, that is no longer tenable, I think, even in the most pessimistic reading of the Vera hypothesis. Actually, probably that is a case where human agency is having an effect in reducing a population which was already under pressure from climate change, maybe. But it's an intriguing question and it deserves a lot more thought.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we've got to the stage where I don't think we can ask any more questions, but I've tried to balance them between archaeological and biodiversity related questions, but there are lots more questions that we haven't been able to touch on. So thank you very much to everybody who's asked questions. Really, really diverse spread in there. So I'll hand over to Tor.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Martin and Tony. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm wondering whether there's anything in summary you would like to say from both of your perspectives for us to close on. Tony, any wise words?
Wise words. Oh my God, what can I say in summary? I mean, I think we suffer from false polarities, and actually that the false polarity between traditional nature conservation and rewilding, I think that's artificial. I think they're all part of the same spectrum. And I think we suffer from false polarities when it comes to thinking about what the landscape used to look like and therefore should look like in the future. I think we underestimate just how diverse it was and therefore how diverse it could be. We try to build simple pictures for ourselves. And I think if you're thinking of a simple picture of the past or the present or future, it's inevitably wrong.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And Martin, I'm really fascinated about in particular, the point about the Cuckmere and the 19th and 20th century history that we're so very attached to, and the meanders that are not connected, and how we see that as the epitome of beauty, landscape beauty, but actually it's got a fascinating history. So from your perspective, any kind of summary closing observations?
Well, I think I'll sort of try to end with perhaps a controversial point, really, and that's letting nature take its course can, of course, produce unexpected, maybe undesirable results, such as the loss of species which are currently protected by careful management. But letting nature take its course has also sometimes produced exciting new insights. The role of wolves in increasing biodiversity in Yellowstone National Park, the contribution of pig rooting to biodiversity on the Knapp estate, or grazing geese on the Oostvaardersplaatsen in the Netherlands. So sometimes rewilding projects can serve the purpose of an exciting scientific experiment which can give us new ways of looking at management strategies.
Thank you. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think there was one question I've seen which is really about the future. So what is this for the future? So I think we'll want to return to some of these conversations. We're going to summarize the questions and do some answers for people. I hope that we get some really interesting and useful feedback after this. And we've discussed whether we wanted to do another conversation with presidents on a different topic, perhaps drove roads, wildlife corridors. I've personally found the hour absolutely fascinating, really appreciated it. And thank you to our audience. And join both of the organisations. It's the last thing to say, isn't it? Of course, two really wonderful membership organisations. And we depend on your support. So just to close now, thank you both.
Thank you
For your time. Bye, everybody.